If you turn on the radio, you might hear the heartbeat of a ghost. His name is Carl Radle. For 50 years, his bass has been the lifeblood of some of the greatest rock records in history. It's been heard in cars, in bars, in packed stadiums. But the man who possessed that great heartbeat died in obscurity. No glory, no acclaim, just drugs, sickness, and the silence of the Oklahoma red dirt. How could a man who shaped the sound of a generation disappear without a trace? This is the tragedy of America's greatest invisible man. It begins far away from the neon lights of London or the sun-bleached strip of Los Angeles. It begins in the heartland of America, in a place where the wind sweeps down the plain with a lonesome, ancient howl. It begins in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Carl Dean Radle was born on June 18, 1942. The world was at war. Across the oceans, empires were burning, but in Tulsa, the rhythm of life was dictated by the oil derricks that dotted the landscape and the relentless baking heat of the Midwestern summer. Tulsa, in the 1940s and 50s, was a city of contradictions. It was the oil capital of the world, a place of sudden roughneck wealth, where men with calloused hands could become millionaires overnight. But it was also a place of deep Dust Bowl poverty, a land still healing from the scars of the Great Depression. It was a city that sat at a crossroads. It wasn't quite the South, though. It had the segregation and the slow, humid pace of life. It wasn't quite the West, though the spirit of the cowboy and the frontier still lingered in the air. It was a liminal space, a cultural melting pot where the fiddle music of the white settlers met the blues and jazz of the deep Greenwood district, the black Wall Street that had risen from the ashes of the 1921 massacre. In this environment, music wasn't a pastime. It was a form of currency. It was in the air, as thick as the humidity. But the music of Tulsa wasn't the polished pop of New York or the frantic energy of Chicago. It was something else. It was something that would later be known to the world as the Tulsa sound. It was a sound defined not by what you played, but by what you didn't play. It was a laid-back, shuffling groove, a rhythm that dragged just slightly behind the beat, as if the musicians were sitting on a porch in the heat, too relaxed to rush. Young Carl Radle was a product of this environment. He was, by all accounts, a quiet boy. In the boisterous, rough-and-tumble world of post-war American boyhood, where the loudest kid usually won, Carl was an observer. He had a gentle face, eyes that seemed to be constantly taking the measure of the room, and a shy demeanor that bordered on invisibility. He wasn't the class clown. He wasn't the quarterback. He was the kind of boy who blended into the background, the kind of boy you might not notice until he was gone. But inside that quiet exterior, there was a deep, resonating sensitivity. Like many children who feel out of step with the noisy world around them, Carl turned to music. It was a language where he didn't have to speak to be understood. His musical journey began, as it did for many children of that era, with the instruments of the school orchestra. He started with the clarinet. Picture young Carl sitting in a rigid chair, trying to force breath through the reed, trying to conform to the strict linear rules of sheet music. It didn't fit. The clarinet is a piercing lead instrument, a voice that cuts through the air. That wasn't Carl. He moved to the piano. Here, he found harmony. He learned the structure of chords, the mathematics of how notes stacked upon one another to create emotion. He had a good ear, a brilliant ear, in fact. He could hear a song on the radio and pick out the progression. But the piano, too, felt like a solitary confinement. It was a stationary instrument. And Carl, despite his quietness, wanted to be part of something larger. He wanted to be in the engine room, not the parlor. He picked up a guitar. Now he was getting closer. The guitar was the weapon of the rock and roll revolution that was just beginning to sweep the nation. Elvis Presley was shaking his hips on the Ed Sullivan Show, and every teenager in America wanted to be a front man. But when Carl held the guitar, he didn't look at the high frets where the solos were played. He found himself drawn to the thick strings, to the bottom end. He found himself listening not to the melody, but to the pulse. Sometime around the age of 15, in the late 1950s, destiny placed a bass guitar in his hands. It was a revelation. To the uninitiated, the bass guitar is often seen as the easy instrument, the one given to the kid who can't play guitar well enough. This is the greatest lie in music history. The bass is the bridge between the rhythm and the melody. The drummer provides the time, the guitarist provides the color, but the bassist provides the context. A C major chord played by a guitar sounds happy, but if the bass player plays an A underneath it, suddenly that happy chord becomes a melancholy A minor seventh. The bassist controls the emotion of the song without anyone realizing it. For a personality like Carl Radle, supportive, steady, reliable, and devoid of ego, the bass was not just an instrument. It was a mirror of his soul. It was heavy. It rumbled against his chest. It didn't demand that he stand at the front of the stage and shake his hips. It allowed him to stand back near the drummer and control the entire room with a subtle twitch of his fingers. He began to practice, but he didn't practice playing fast. He practiced playing time. In the bedrooms and garages of Tulsa, while other boys were trying to shred like Chuck Berry, Carl was learning the discipline of the groove. He was learning the specific dialect of the Tulsa sound. He wasn't alone. Tulsa, in the late 50s and early 60s, was a secret incubator for some of the greatest musicians the world would ever know. It was a small, incestuous scene where everyone knew everyone. Teenagers were sneaking into clubs to watch the older cats play. Among his peers were figures who would become legends. There was a young, wild piano player named Leon Russell, a man with fingers of fire who would go on to become one of the most influential session musicians in history. There was J.J. Cale, a guitarist whose whisper-quiet vocal style and shuffle rhythm would essentially create the blueprint for Eric Clapton's solo career. And there was David Gates, who would later find fame with the band Bread. Carl fell into this crowd not as a star, but as the guy everyone wanted in their band. Why? Because when Carl played, you sounded better. It was a simple, magical equation. He didn't overplay. He didn't step on your toes. He left space. On a humid Friday night in Tulsa, 1960, a smoky club on the outskirts of town, a group of teenagers is on stage sweating through their cheap suits trying to play a Ray Charles cover. The drummer is rushing, adrenaline pushing the tempo faster and faster. The guitarist is fumbling, trying to find the right chord. The music is about to derail, to collapse into a cacophony of noise. And then Carl Radle leans into his amp. He plucks a single note. It's a low G, fat and round and solid as an oak tree. He holds it. He waits. He locks eyes with the drummer and gives a barely perceptible nod. He plays the next note right in the pocket, pulling the tempo back, anchoring the chaos. Suddenly, the band tightens. The guitarist finds his place. The singer relaxes. The audience starts to dance. They don't know why the music suddenly got better. They don't look at the tall, bespectacled guy in the back with the stoic expression. They look at the singer. But the musicians know. They know that Carl just saved them. This was his reputation, the musician's musician. By the time he graduated from high school, Carl Radle was a fixture in the local scene. But Tulsa, for all its hidden magic, was still a small pond. The music industry was in New York, in Los Angeles, in London. If you stayed in Tulsa, you became a local legend, playing the same bars for 40 years until you died on a bar stool. Carl wanted more, but unlike the ambitious firebrands who packed their bags and hitched rides to Hollywood with dreams of movie stardom, Carl's ambition was quieter. He just wanted to work. He wanted to play. His first taste of the big time didn't come from the gritty blues or the cool jazz he loved. It came from pop music. In the mid-1960s, a bizarre phenomenon occurred. The son of the famous comedian Jerry Lewis, a young man named Gary Lewis, decided he wanted to be a rock star. He had the name, he had the connections, but he needed a band. The band that was assembled was called Gary Lewis and the Playboys. To the rock purists of the time, they were a joke, a bubblegum pop act manufactured for teenage girls, touring the world on the back of massive hits like This Diamond Ring. They were the antithesis of the serious, gritty Tulsa sound. But for Carl Radle, this was the university. He joined the band in the latter half of the 1960s. Suddenly, the boy from Oklahoma was on television. He was appearing on The Ed Sullivan Show, the same program where he had watched Elvis years before. He was wearing matching suits, smiling for the cameras, and playing simple, catchy bass lines for screaming teenagers. It would have been easy to become cynical. Many musicians would have taken the money and hated the music. But Carl treated it with the same seriousness he applied to the blues. He learned the rigors of the road. He learned how to deal with the press, how to navigate the exhausting schedule of a touring pop act, and how to perform with consistency night after night, regardless of how tired or sick he felt. More importantly, it got him out of Oklahoma. It brought him to Los Angeles. Los Angeles in the late 1960s was the epicenter of the cultural earthquake. The hippie movement was in full swing. The Sunset Strip was a riot of long hair, psychedelic drugs, and revolutionary politics. The music was changing, evolving from the innocence of the early 60s into something harder, darker, and more complex. When Gary Lewis was drafted into the Vietnam War, the Playboys effectively disbanded. For many hired gun musicians, this would have been the end of the line, a ticket back to Tulsa and a job at a gas station. But Carl Radle had already made an impression. In the recording studios of LA, word spreads fast. Producers don't care about your image. They care about time is money. They need a guy who can walk into a room, look at a chart he's never seen before, and nail the take on the first try. They need a guy who doesn't argue, doesn't show up drunk, and doesn't try to play a bass solo in the middle of a ballad. They needed Carl Radle. He slipped seamlessly into the world of the session musician. This is a shadowy fraternity in the music business. These are the ghosts in the machine. You hear them on your favorite records, but their names are often missing from the album jackets. They are the mercenaries of melody. Carl worked. He worked constantly. He played on country records, pop records, rock records. He absorbed styles like a sponge. He was living the dream of the working musician, paying his bills with his instrument, respected by his peers, living in the California sunshine. But there is a danger in being a session musician. It is a lonely life. You are a hired hand. You have no creative control. You are brought in to build someone else's house, and once the roof is on, you are asked to leave. You don't get to live there. You don't get the glory. You are a tool, albeit a highly skilled one. Carl was searching for a home. He missed the camaraderie of a real band, the brotherhood of guys who sweat together and bleed together on stage. He missed the feeling of the Tulsa scene, where music was a conversation, not a transaction. And then in the swirling, chaotic social scene of late 60s Los Angeles, he reconnected with some old friends from home. The Tulsa diaspora was strong in LA. Leon Russell was there, building his own empire. And through these connections, Carl found himself in the orbit of a husband and wife duo who were about to shake up the rock world. Their names were Delaney and Bonnie Bramlett. Delaney and Bonnie were a force of nature. They weren't just a duo, they were a traveling circus, a musical revue that blended white soul, gospel, blues, and rock into a sweaty, fervor-filled revival. They didn't just hire musicians, they collected them. They called their backing group the Friends, and it was a revolving door of the greatest talent in the world. Carl joined up. He found himself playing alongside a powerhouse drummer named Jim Gordon, a man with a beat so heavy it could crack pavement, and a keyboardist named Bobby Whitlock, a southern boy with a voice like gravel and honey. Together, Radle, Gordon, and Whitlock formed a rhythm section that was terrifyingly good. They were a single organism. They locked in together with a precision that was almost supernatural. They brought that laid-back, swampy, Tulsa-infused groove to Delaney and Bonnie's music, creating a sound that was irresistible. It was 1969. The summer of love was over. The dark, cynical 70s were looming on the horizon. The Beatles were breaking up. The Rolling Stones were dealing with the death of Brian Jones. The rock world was in a state of flux, looking for the next direction. And in England, a man named Eric Clapton, the god of the guitar, the superstar of Cream and Blind Faith, was feeling lost. He was the most famous guitarist on the planet, but he was miserable. He was tired of the ego battles, tired of the heavy, complex, psychedelic rock, tired of being the front man. He wanted to get back to the roots. He wanted to be just a guitar player in a band. Fate was about to arrange a meeting. Delaney and Bonnie were booked to open for Clapton's supergroup Blind Faith on a tour of America. Carl Radle packed his bass. He checked his amplifier. He stood on the side of the stage, ready to do his job. He had no idea that he was about to step onto a path that would lead him to the highest peaks of musical history and down into the darkest valleys of the human soul. He was about to meet God, and God was looking for a foundation. The summer of 1969 was a season of fire. The world was watching the Apollo 11 astronauts walk on the moon, staring up at the heavens in wonder. But down on the American interstates aboard a fleet of sweating, rattling tour buses, a different kind of history was being written. Carl Radle was sitting in the back of a bus watching the landscape of America roll by. He was a member of The Friends, the backing band for Delaney and Bonnie Bramlett. They were the opening act for the biggest tour of the year, the debut American trek of Blind Faith. Blind Faith was supposed to be the supergroup to end all supergroups. It featured Eric Clapton on guitar, Ginger Baker, the wild-eyed beast from Cream, on drums, Steve Winwood, the golden voice of Traffic, on keyboards and vocals, and Rick Gresh on bass. On paper, they were invincible. They were the musical equivalent of the New York Yankees. They were gods. But from his vantage point in the opening act, Carl Radle saw something else. He saw a crumbling empire. Every night, Blind Faith would take the stage to deafening applause. They played with immense technical skill, intricate time signatures, and dazzling solos. But there was a coldness to it. There was a distance. They were playing at the audience, not with them. Backstage, the atmosphere in the Blind Faith dressing room was tense, filled with the silence of men who were trapped in a contract, burdened by impossible expectations. Clapton, in particular, looked miserable. He was the guitar god, a title he loathed. He felt like a statue on a pedestal, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then there was Delaney and Bonnie. When Carl Radle stepped onto the stage with Delaney and Bonnie, the energy shifted. They weren't gods. They were a revival meeting. They were a southern-fried, gospel-infused rock and roll circus. They didn't have complex light shows or extended drum solos. They had groove. Radle, standing next to drummer Jim Gordon, would lock into a pocket so deep it felt like the bottom of the Mississippi River. Bobby Whitlock would hammer the Hammond organ, creating a swirling vortex of sound. Delaney Bramlett would shout and dance, and the whole band would move as one living, breathing organism. It was messy, it was sweaty, and it was alive. And Eric Clapton was watching. Every night after Blind Faith soundcheck, Clapton would find himself drawn to the Delaney and Bonnie dressing room. He was drawn to the laughter, the camaraderie, the acoustic guitars being passed around, the feeling of family. But mostly he was drawn to the rhythm section. He was mesmerized by Carl Radle. Clapton had played with Jack Bruce in Cream, a bassist who played like a lead guitarist, constantly challenging and fighting for sonic space. He was playing with Rick Gretsch, a fine musician, but one who played with a British reserve. Radle was different. Radle played simply. He played the root notes. He played with a thumping, percussive mute that sounded like a heartbeat. He didn't try to compete with the guitar. He cradled it. For Clapton, who was desperate to escape the pressure of being a virtuoso, Radle's playing was a warm blanket. It was permission to relax. It was the Tulsa sound, that laid-back, porch-sitting rhythm, and it seduced the British superstar completely. By the middle of the tour, a strange phenomenon began to occur. The headliner started asking if he could play with the opening act. Eric Clapton, the most famous guitarist in the world, would quietly walk on stage during Delaney and Bonnie's set, plug in his guitar, and stand in the back line next to Carl. He didn't take solos. He just played rhythm. He smiled. For the first time in years, he looked happy. He was falling in love, not with a woman, but with a band, and specifically with the engine room of that band, Radle, Gordon, and Whitlock. When the Blind Faith tour ended, the supergroup imploded instantly. They played their last note and walked away from each other without looking back. Clapton was free, and he knew exactly where he wanted to go. He didn't want to form another supergroup. He didn't want to be the leader. He wanted to be a friend. He joined Delaney and Bonnie. He packed his bags and went on tour with them as a sideman. It was a shocking move for a man of his stature, but it was a necessary cleansing of his soul. And it was during this period, crowded into buses and small planes, that the bond between Clapton and Radle was forged. Carl Radle was not a man of many words. He didn't fawn over Clapton's celebrity. He treated him like just another guitar player. If Clapton rushed the tempo, Carl would drag the beat back, forcing him to slow down, to feel the space. If Clapton overplayed, Carl would simplify his bass line, grounding him. It was a silent musical conversation. Calm down, Eric, just play. I've got you. But the volatile dynamic of Delaney and Bonnie couldn't last forever. Delaney Bramlett was a brilliant but difficult leader, and tensions over money and credit began to fracture the group. By the spring of 1970, the friends were drifting apart. Clapton saw his chance. He didn't just want to be a part of their band. He wanted them to be his band. He made the call. He recruited the rhythm section. Carl Radle on bass, Jim Gordon on drums, Bobby Whitlock on keys. They gathered in England at Clapton's country estate, Hurtwood Edge. The transition was seamless. They had played together so much on the road that they already had a telepathic connection. They were a machine, but they were a machine without a name and, at first, without a purpose. Their first test came from another Beatle. George Harrison had just left the Beatles and was preparing to record his massive triple album, All Things Must Pass. He needed a backing band that could create a wall of sound. He called his friend Eric, and Eric brought the Dominos. If you listen to All Things Must Pass, to the title track or What is Life, you are hearing Carl Radle. You are hearing that thick, gummy bass line that holds together the massive layers of acoustic guitars and horns. The sessions were a masterclass in discipline. Phil Spector, the producer, demanded take after take, layering sound upon sound. Radle never wavered. He was the rock upon which Harrison built his cathedral. But while they were recording for George by day, they were becoming a band by night. They began to write songs. Clapton was pouring his heart out, writing music that was raw, painful, and deeply personal. He was tortured by his unrequited love for Pattie Boyd, George Harrison's wife. He was living in a state of high romantic tragedy, and he needed a musical vessel to hold that pain. They needed a name. Clapton was adamant his name could not be on the marquee. He was terrified of the Clapton is God hype. He wanted anonymity. He wanted to be just one of the guys. There are many stories about how they chose the name. Some say it was a mispronunciation of Derek and the Dynamos. Some say Derek was a nickname for Clapton, but Derek and the Dominos stuck. It sounded unpretentious. It sounded like a doo-wop group from the 50s. It was a mask. Under this mask, they played their first gig at the Lyceum Ballroom in London in June 1970. The audience was confused. Who were these guys? Why was Eric Clapton standing to the side? But the music was undeniable. It was a swampy blues rock thunderstorm. But England was too cold, too restrictive. To truly capture the sound they were chasing, they needed heat. They needed America. Specifically, they needed Miami. In late August 1970, Carl Radle boarded a plane to Miami, Florida. He was heading to Criteria Studios to work with the legendary producer, Tom Dowd. This journey would become the defining moment of his life. Criteria Studios was a nondescript building, but inside, magic happened. The air in Miami was thick with humidity, smelling of salt and asphalt. But inside the studio, the air was thick with something else: smoke, anticipation, and an escalating reliance on chemistry. By this point, the band's drug use had moved beyond the casual recreational habits of the 60s. Cocaine and heroin were beginning to creep into the picture. For Clapton, it was a way to numb the pain of his heartache. For the others, it was the fuel to keep going, to keep playing, to keep the energy high. Carl Radle, the quiet observer, partook. He was never the wildest one. That title belonged to Jim Gordon or the fiery Bobby Whitlock. But he was there, in the haze. Yet remarkably, it never seemed to affect his hands. His playing remained stoic, precise, unshakable. The sessions for what would become the album Layla and other assorted love songs began. The band set up in a circle, playing live. There was no isolation booths, no separation. They played loud. They wanted the sound of the room, the bleed of the instruments into each other's microphones. Radle's role in these sessions cannot be overstated. Listen to a track like Keep On Growing. The guitars are weaving intricate tapestries, dual leads spiraling around each other. The drums are frenetic. But the bass? Radle is playing a counter melody, a funky driving line that pushes the song forward like a diesel locomotive. He isn't just keeping time, he is providing the melodic context for the jam, or Listen to Any Day. It's a song of desperation. Radle's bass is heavy, almost muddy, dragging slightly behind the beat, giving the song a sense of weary weight. It sounds like a man walking through quicksand, refusing to give up. That was the Tulsa touch, but something was missing. The band was good, great even, but they hadn't yet reached the stratosphere. They needed a spark. They needed lightning. Lightning arrived in the form of Duane Allman. The Allman Brothers Band was playing a show in Miami. Clapton, a huge fan, insisted the band go see them. After the show, he invited Duane back to the studio. When Duane Allman walked into Criteria Studios, the energy in the room changed instantly. Here was the greatest slide guitar player in the world, a man with a fiery, intense Southern spirit. He plugged in his Les Paul. He looked at Clapton. They started to play. For a bassist, this is a nightmare scenario. You now have two of the greatest, loudest, most dominant lead guitarists in history trading solos, fighting for sonic space, filling every frequency with screaming, tube-driven distortion. A lesser bassist would have panicked. A lesser bassist would have tried to play louder, tried to fill the gaps, and the result would have been a muddy, incoherent mess. Carl Radle did the opposite. He went simpler. He went deeper. As Clapton and Allman soared into the stratosphere, trading licks that sounded like eagles fighting, Radle anchored them to the earth. He locked in with Jim Gordon's kick drum and refused to budge. He created a sonic floor so solid that the guitarists could take any risk, jump off any cliff knowing that Carl would be there to catch them. This dynamic is perfectly captured in the title track, Layla. The first half of the song is a hurricane. The famous opening riff, 7 notes that change rock history, is a declaration of war. It is loud, aggressive, hysterical. During these sections, Radle is driving hard, his bass panned to the center, a thumping pulse of pure adrenaline. But then, the storm breaks. The song shifts. We enter the piano coda. This second half of Layla is perhaps the most beautiful 3 minutes in rock history. It is the sound of acceptance, of a storm passing, of the sun coming out over a ravaged landscape. Jim Gordon, who is credited with writing the piano part, though controversy remains, begins that haunting elegiac melody on the piano. Duane Allman's slide guitar begins to weep, sounding like a bird circling high above. And what is Carl Radle doing? He is playing one of the most exquisite bass lines ever recorded. He isn't just following the piano. He is playing a melody of his own. It is high on the neck of the bass, a counterpoint that sings. It is gentle, tender, and incredibly sad. It is the sound of a heart breaking in slow motion. Close your eyes and listen to the end of Layla. Really, listen. Ignore the guitars for a moment. Listen to the low end. That is Carl Radle speaking to us. He is saying, it's okay. The pain is real, but it's beautiful. Let it go. In that studio in Miami, amidst the empty bottles and the haze of smoke, they captured lightning in a bottle. They created a masterpiece. But masterpieces take a toll on their creators. The emotional intensity of the sessions was draining. Clapton was pouring his literal soul into the microphone, screaming his love for a woman he couldn't have. The drugs were becoming less of a party favor and more of a necessity to numb the raw nerves. When the album was finished, the band was exhausted. They had created Layla, but they had also depleted themselves. They released the album in November 1970, and in one of the great ironies of music history, it flopped. It didn't hit number 1. The radio stations were confused. The song Layla was too long. The name Derek and the Dominos meant that casual fans didn't realize it was an Eric Clapton album. The critics were lukewarm. This was a crushing blow. They had bared their souls and the world had shrugged. They went on tour to support the album, but the joy was beginning to curdle. The drugs, which had been a creative lubricant in Miami, were now becoming a wall between them. Paranoia set in. The camaraderie of the Friends' days was evaporating. Carl Radle watched it all happen from his spot by the drum riser. He saw Clapton withdrawing further into himself. He saw Jim Gordon becoming more erratic, the voices in his head beginning to whisper darker things. He saw the dream beginning to fray at the edges, but he kept playing. He kept showing up. He kept the beat, because that was what he did. He was the foundation, and a foundation does not leave, even when the house is burning. He didn't know it yet, but the fire was just beginning. The peak of the mountain had been reached, and the only way left was down, and the descent would be steep, slippery, and deadly. The dominoes were about to fall. The come down is always harder than the climb. When Derek and the Dominos left Miami in the late autumn of 1970, they left pieces of themselves on the floor of Criteria Studios. They had achieved a state of musical grace that few bands ever touch. They had stared into the sun, but they had forgotten to wear sunglasses. The album Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs was in the can. It was a masterpiece of raw, bleeding emotion. But a masterpiece is a heavy thing to carry, especially when the world refuses to acknowledge its weight. The commercial failure of the album upon its release was a bewilderment. It was like shouting, "I love you" into a canyon and hearing no echo. For Eric Clapton, it was a confirmation of his deepest fears, that without the celebrity mask of Cream or Blind Faith, without the hype, he was nothing. For Carl Radle, it was a confusion. He knew what they had played. He had felt the electricity in the room when Duane Allman's slide guitar wept over his bass lines. He knew it was real. So why wasn't the world listening? But there was no time to mourn. The machine demanded to be fed. The record label, eager to recoup their investment, pushed the band out onto the road. And so, the Dominos began a tour of the United States that would become the stuff of dark legend. If the Miami sessions were a creative explosion, the tour was the fallout. The camaraderie of the Friends era, that innocent communal vibe of Delaney and Bonnie, was rapidly decaying. It was being replaced by a darker, more insular atmosphere. The drugs were changing. The marijuana and psychedelics of the 60s, which expanded the mind, were being replaced by the hard powders of the 70s, heroin and cocaine, which narrowed the soul. Carl Radle stood at the center of this gathering storm, his face impassive behind his wire-rimmed glasses. On stage, the band was often magnificent. The chemistry was still there, a muscle memory forged in sweat. When they launched into "Why Does Love Got to Be So Sad?" or "Tell the Truth," they were a freight train. Radle and Jim Gordon were a rhythm section of terrifying power, pushing Clapton to play with a ferocity that bordered on violence. But off stage, the silence was growing. The laughter was becoming brittle. Paranoia, the unwanted stepchild of heavy cocaine use, began to seep into the dressing rooms. They traveled in a bubble, isolated from the world and from each other. Carl, ever the observer, saw the cracks widening. He saw Jim Gordon, the handsome golden boy drummer, becoming increasingly erratic. Gordon was hearing voices. At the time, they chalked it up to the drugs, to the exhaustion of the road. No one knew the clinical term, schizophrenia, was lurking in the synapses of their drummer's brain. They just knew that Jim was different, intense, sometimes scary, and he saw Eric Clapton fading. The god was becoming a ghost. The unrequited love for Pattie Boyd was a black hole in his chest, and he was filling it with heroin. He was physically there, playing the notes, but his eyes were looking at something far away. Carl's role shifted. He was no longer just the bassist. He was the caretaker, the anchor. On stage, if Eric started to drift, if the tempo started to sag, Carl would lock in harder. He would thump the root note with a little more aggression, a subtle musical nudge. "Wake up, Eric, we're here. We're working." The tour ended, leaving them exhausted and wealthy, but spiritually bankrupt. They returned to England in early 1971 with a mandate: record the second album. This is the great what if of rock history. The second Derek and the Dominos album. It was meant to be the solidification of their legacy. Instead, it became their tombstone. They booked time at Olympic Studios in London. It was the spring of 1971. The weather was gray, matching the mood in the room. They set up their gear. The engineers placed the microphones. The tape machines were ready to roll, but the magic of Miami was gone. In its place was a thick, suffocating wall of tension. The sessions were a disaster. The band was fractured. Clapton and Gordon, the two dominant personalities, were at war. Gordon, fueled by his inner demons and his immense talent, wanted more creative control. He wanted to write songs. He wanted to dictate the arrangements. Clapton, lost in the haze of addiction, was resentful and withdrawn. Carl Radle sat in the middle, holding his bass, waiting. The scene inside the cavernous studio in London was bleak. Hours of silence. The sound of a lighter flicking, the sound of a drumstick tapping a cymbal over and over again, an irritant rather than a rhythm. They tried to play. They jammed for hours, aimless, meandering jams that went nowhere. The tapes from these sessions, some of which were later released, are painful to hear. They are the sound of a band drowning. Carl tried. He brought his Tulsa groove. He tried to lock in with Gordon to find that pocket that had been so easy just a year before. But you can't groove with a drummer who is fighting a war in his own head. You can't support a guitarist who is nodding off against his amplifier. The breaking point came swiftly. The details are shrouded in the fog of memory and drugs, but the legend goes that during a particularly tense session, an argument erupted between Clapton and Gordon. Words were exchanged. Egos clashed. And just like that, the spell broke. Clapton walked out. He said, "I'm done." And he meant it. Derek and the Dominos, the band that had produced the greatest love song in history, was over. They dissolved not with a bang, but with a whimper, a slamming door, a silence in a studio. Carl Radle packed up his bass. He unplugged his amp. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He knew a dead thing when he saw it. He walked out into the London rain, a man without a band. But the universe wasn't finished punishing them. The disintegration of the band was just the prelude to the tragedy. In October of 1971, the phone rang. The news came from America. Duane Allman, Skydog, the man whose slide guitar had given Layla its wings. He was dead. A motorcycle accident in Macon, Georgia. He was 24 years old. The shock was physical. For Clapton, it was a devastation. Duane had been his musical soulmate, the brother he never had, the only man who could look him in the eye and make him play better. To lose him so young, so senselessly, felt like a cosmic judgment. It felt like a punishment for their hubris. For Carl, the grief was quiet and deep. He had stood between those two giants. He had felt the heat of their interplay. To know that the sound, that specific soaring twin guitar sound, could never happen again was a profound loss. The foundation was still there, but one of the spires had collapsed. The death of Duane Allman was the final nail in the coffin of Eric Clapton's will to live in the world. He retreated. He shut the gates of his estate, Hurtwood Edge in the Surrey countryside. He pulled the blinds. He locked the doors. Thus began the lost years. From late 1971 until 1974, Eric Clapton effectively ceased to exist as a public figure. He became a hermit, subsisting on a diet of heroin, chocolate, and television. He stopped listening to new music. He stopped playing guitar. He was a man waiting to die, surrounded by piles of unwashed laundry and the ghosts of his own brilliance. And where was Carl Radle? This is the part of the story that defines the man. Most session musicians, faced with an unemployed junkie bandleader, would have moved on. They would have picked up the phone, called a producer in L.A. or New York, and found a new gig. "Clapton's finished," they would have said. "I need to pay the rent." Carl Radle could have done that. He was one of the most respected bassists in the world. He could have played for anyone. The Rolling Stones, Dylan, the Eagles, anyone would have taken him. But he didn't. He went back to Tulsa. Yes, he played some local gigs to keep his fingers moving. But his heart remained in Surrey behind those locked gates. He refused to let go. He became the keeper of the flame. During those dark, silent years, Carl Radle became a lifeline. He would record cassette tapes of song ideas. He would find old blues, tracks he thought Eric might like, and he would send them to England. These packages arrived at the gloomy mansion in Surrey. Amidst the drug deliveries and the unpaid bills, a package from Tulsa would arrive, a tape from Carl, a gentle nudge. "I'm still here, Eric. The music is still here. Whenever you're ready." It was a loyalty that bordered on the irrational. Why wait for a junkie? Why tether your career to a sinking ship? Perhaps it was because Carl knew the truth. He knew that the God persona was fake, but the man inside, the fragile, broken man who loved the blues, was real, and Carl loved that man. He felt a protective duty. He had been the foundation on stage. Now he had to be the foundation in life. Or perhaps it was because Carl, too, was adrift. Without Clapton, without that specific chemistry, nothing else felt right. He had tasted the ambrosia of the gods. How could he go back to playing pop jingles? But the waiting took a toll on Carl, too. Idleness is the enemy of the addict. Back in Tulsa, with no tours to structure his days, the drinking increased. The quiet boy began to disappear into the bottle. It was a slow, creeping erosion. The Tulsa sound is laid back, but if you lay back too far, you never get up. He waited. 1972 passed in a blur of silence. The rock world moved on. Led Zeppelin was conquering the globe. David Bowie was inventing glam rock. The Rolling Stones were in exile. Clapton was a rumor, a memory, then a flicker of light. Pete Townshend, the guitarist of The Who, decided that he couldn't let his friend Eric die. He organized an intervention, disguised as a concert. He convinced Eric to come out of hiding for one night. A comeback show at the Rainbow Theatre in London, January 13th, 1973. It was a do-or-die moment. Townshend assembled an all-star band to support Eric, Ron Wood on guitar, Steve Winwood on keys, Jim Capaldi on drums, and on bass. There was only one choice. Eric said, "Get Carl." Carl Radle flew to London. He walked into the rehearsal room and saw his friend. Eric was pale, thin, shaking. He looked like a man who had walked through hell. But when he saw Carl, there was a spark of recognition, a connection. The Rainbow concert is legendary, not because the music was perfect, but because it happened at all. Listen to the bootlegs. The band is loose, sometimes sloppy. Eric is struggling. His voice is weak. His fingers are stiff from years of neglect. He is sweating, clearly under the influence, clearly terrified. But listen to the bass. Carl Radle is the glue holding the entire fragile, chaotic mess together. He is playing simple, strong lines. He is watching Eric's hands like a hawk. When Eric misses a chord change, Carl is there to cover it, to bridge the gap, to guide the song back to the tonic. There is a moment in the concert during Badge where the bridge builds up. Eric falters slightly. The band wobbles. And then Carl hits a low E, a resonant, booming note that shakes the floor. The band aligns. The song explodes. Carl wasn't just playing bass that night. He was carrying his friend. He was saying with every note, "You can do this. I won't let you fall." The concert was a success. The critics were kind. The fans were ecstatic to see their hero alive. It proved that Eric Clapton could still command a stage, but a single concert is not a cure. After the applause died down, Eric retreated back to Surrey. He wasn't ready to be clean. He wasn't ready to tour. The heroine was still the master. Carl flew back to Tulsa. The waiting resumed. This period, the post-Rainbow lull of 1973, was perhaps the hardest for Carl. The hope had been dangled, then snatched away. The depression deepened. The alcohol became a constant companion. He was a man in purgatory. He was the greatest bassist of his generation, sitting in a living room in Oklahoma, staring at the phone. He was a soldier without a war, a knight without a king. But Carl Radle possessed a stubbornness that was as deep as his groove. He refused to give up on the idea of the band. He believed with a religious fervor that they could reclaim the magic. He kept sending the tapes. He kept writing. He kept hoping. And finally, in 1974, the dam broke. Eric Clapton decided to clean up. He traded the heroin for alcohol. He wanted to make a record. He wanted to go to America. Specifically, he wanted to go to Miami, back to the scene of the crime, back to Criteria Studios. He called Carl. "I'm ready," he said. Carl didn't hesitate. He didn't ask about money. He didn't ask for a contract. He packed his bass. He packed his bags. He left the dust of Tulsa behind. But he didn't go alone. He knew that the old Dominos were gone. Dwayne was dead. Jim Gordon was lost to madness. They needed new blood. They needed a new sound. Carl reached into his Tulsa connections. He called a drummer named Jamie Oldeker. He called a guitarist named George Terry. He called a vocalist named Yvonne Elliman. He assembled a new family for Eric. He built a new foundation. When Carl Radle arrived in Miami in 1974, he looked different. He was a little heavier. His face was a little puffier. The years of waiting and drinking had left their mark. But when he plugged into the amp, the sound was the same, that deep, reassuring throb. The resurrection was about to begin. The lost years were over. The era of the guitar god was dead, and the era of the laid-back troubadour was about to be born. And Carl Radle was the architect who would draw the blueprints. But even as the sun began to rise on Clapton's career, the shadows were lengthening over Carl's soul. He had saved the king, but in doing so, he had forgotten to save himself. 1974 was not just a new year. It was a new atmosphere. The darkness of the Surrey winters and the heroin-soaked isolation of the lost years were gone. In their place was the blinding white sun of Miami, the turquoise waters of the Atlantic, and a house that would become as famous as the music recorded inside it, 461 Ocean Boulevard. Carl Radle had done the impossible. He had coaxed the hermit out of the cave. He had brought Eric Clapton back to the land of the living. But the man who stepped off the plane in Florida was not the same guitar god who had burned down the world with Cream, nor the tortured romantic of Derek and the Dominos. This was a fragile, trembling man, swapping the needle for the bottle, trading the screaming intensity of the blues for something softer, slower, and safer. And Carl Radle, ever the architect, built the perfect sonic house for this new Eric to live in. He surrounded Clapton with home. The band Carl assembled, the Tulsa Mafia, was handpicked to create a specific vibe. He brought in Jamie Oldeker on drums, a man with a shuffle so deep it felt like a heartbeat. He brought in Dick Sims on keyboards, whose B3 organ provided a warm, church-like cushion. And he brought in George Terry, a local Florida guitarist, to shoulder the lead burdens when Eric's hands were too shaky to fly. The sessions at Criteria Studios were unlike the intense, bloodletting sessions of Layla. These were lazy. They were soaked in alcohol. The band lived together in the house on Ocean Boulevard, a frat house of recovering addicts and functioning alcoholics. They fished, they drank, they jammed, and occasionally they recorded. It was here that Carl Radle's genius truly shone, though in a way that was almost entirely invisible to the casual listener. The music they were making was a radical departure. It was laid back. It was a fusion of the Tulsa Shuffle country R&B and a new rhythm that was just beginning to filter into the American consciousness from Jamaica, reggae. When George Terry introduced Clapton to Bob Marley's Burnin' album, Eric was hesitant. Reggae is a music of the one drop, a rhythmic structure completely alien to a blues player. It requires a bassist who understands space more than notes. Listen to the cover of I Shot the Sheriff. It became Eric Clapton's only #1 hit in the United States. It revived his career overnight, but strip away Eric's voice. Listen to the track. The guitar is choppy, scratching. The organ is bubbling. But the bass? Carl Radle is playing a masterclass in restraint. He plays a line that is simple, hypnotic, and utterly heavy. He leaves massive gaps of silence, allowing the groove to breathe. He anchors the song's unfamiliar rhythm, translating the Jamaican patois into a language that American rock radio could understand. Without Carl's bass line, that cover version collapses into a novelty act. With it, it became a juggernaut. The album 461 Ocean Boulevard was released in July 1974. It was a massive success. The critics hailed the return of the king. The fans flocked to the record stores. The money began to pour in like a tidal wave. Carl Radle should have been ecstatic. He was the musical director of the biggest comeback in rock history. He was the right-hand man to the biggest star in the world. He was making more money than he had ever dreamed of in the dusty streets of Tulsa. But success is a dangerous narcotic. And for a man with an addictive personality, the high of success needs to be maintained. The tour that followed in 1974 was a descent into a different kind of madness. If the Layla tour was fueled by the frantic energy of cocaine and the doomed romance of unrequited love, the 461 Ocean Boulevard tour was fueled by the sloppy, numbing haze of brandy and vodka. It became known as the Drunk Tour. Clapton was functionally an alcoholic. He would go on stage with a bottle of Courvoisier or vodka. Sometimes he was brilliant, sometimes he was a disaster. There were nights when he would play with his back to the audience. There were nights when he would stop playing in the middle of a song to rant at the crowd. There were nights when he would lie down on the stage and refuse to get up. And through it all, there was Carl. The pressure was immense. He was standing in front of 20,000 screaming fans in a sold-out arena. The spotlight is on your friend, the God, and your friend is unraveling. He is forgetting the chords. He is slurring the lyrics. The audience is getting restless. The energy is turning hostile. A lesser musician would panic. A lesser friend would walk off. Carl Radle dug in. He became the safety net. When Eric's timing wavered, Carl would lock eyes with Jamie Oldacre on drums, and together they would build a rhythmic wall so solid that Eric could lean on it without falling over. They simplified the arrangements on the fly. They covered his mistakes. They turned his drunken pauses into dramatic tension. Carl was the designated driver of a car that was careening down the highway at 100 miles per hour with a drunk at the wheel. But who drives the designated driver? To cope with the stress, to cope with the sheer grinding boredom of the road, the endless cycle of hotel rooms, airports, sound checks, and shows, Carl drank. He drank to match Eric's mood. He drank to numb the anxiety of never knowing which Eric would show up on stage, the genius or the drunkard. The Tulsa Mafia became a drinking club. It was a bonding ritual. They were the boys. They were in it together. The alcohol was the glue that held the band together, even as it was slowly dissolving their organs. But there was a difference between Eric and Carl. Eric Clapton was a supernova. He had handlers, managers, and a global infrastructure designed to keep him alive and profitable. If he passed out, someone carried him to bed. If he got sick, the best doctors were summoned. Carl Radle was just a bass player. He was disposable. As the tours rolled on, 1975, 1976, the physical toll began to manifest. Carl, once the lanky, bespectacled kid, began to look bloated. His face was puffy. His eyes were often hidden behind dark sunglasses, even indoors. He moved a little slower. The laid-back style was becoming a physical necessity. He didn't have the energy to rush, even if he wanted to. yet the music remained impeccable. This is the paradox of the functional alcoholic musician. The muscle memory is so deep, the connection to the instrument so profound, that the hands can work even when the brain is swimming. The albums kept coming. There's one in every crowd. EC was here. No Reason to Cry. Carl was on all of them. He was the constant. He wrote songs too. He was integral to the arrangements. While he didn't always get the writing credit, his fingerprints were on the structure of every song. He was contributing more than just bass lines. He was shaping the identity of Clapton's solo career. This era of Clapton's music, the mid-70s, is often criticized by rock purists as being too soft or too commercial. But listen to the bass playing on a track like The Core from the Slow Hand album, recorded slightly later but in the same spirit. It is a 9-minute jam featuring a saxophone solo by Mel Collins. Radle's bass line on The Core is a monster. It is a driving, relentless, funk-infused riff that never lets up. It is physically demanding to play. It requires stamina and precision. Even in the depths of his addiction, Carl Radle could summon the thunder. He was proving, night after night, that he was still one of the best in the world. But the golden handcuffs were tightening. Carl was trapped. He couldn't leave. He was making too much money, and more importantly, his entire identity was wrapped up in being Eric Clapton's bassist. He was the silent giant. Without Eric, who was he? Just another guy from Tulsa, and Eric needed him. Or so he thought. Their relationship had morphed into a codependency. They were brothers in arms, brothers in the bottle. They enabled each other. Eric's drinking justified Carl's drinking, and vice versa. "We're just having a good time," they would say. "This is rock and roll." But the cracks in the brotherhood were beginning to show. Clapton's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and offensive. The infamous 1976 Birmingham concert, where Clapton went on a drunken, racist tirade on stage, was a low point. It shocked the world. It spawned the Rock Against Racism movement. Carl Radle stood on that stage while his friends shouted slurs into the microphone. We don't know exactly what he was thinking. Carl was a man who had played in mixed-race bands his whole life. He had come up in the Tulsa scene, which revered black music. He had played with Taj Mahal. He worshipped the blues. To hear the man he loved and supported spewing hate must have been a knife in the heart. But Carl did what he always did. He stayed silent. He played the next song. He kept the beat. This silence is the tragedy of the enabler. By refusing to confront the monster, you allow it to grow. Carl's loyalty, once his greatest virtue, was becoming his fatal flaw. He was protecting a man who was losing his mind, and in the process, he was losing his own soul. By 1976, the band relocated to Malibu, California, to record No Reason to Cry at the legendary Shangri-La Studios. This was the headquarters of the band, Bob Dylan's former backing group. The atmosphere was a chaotic carnival. Dylan was there. Ron Wood was there. The studio was filled with legends, hangers-on, and dealers. In this environment, Carl Radle was fading into the upholstery. He was the old man of the group, even though he was only in his mid-30s. He was exhausted. The years of touring, the years of sleeping on buses, the years of waking up hungover and doing it all again, it was wearing him down. There is a sadness in the photos of Carl from this era. He is often sitting in the corner holding a drink, looking at the camera with a weary, knowing expression. It is the look of a man who knows the party is over, but doesn't know how to leave. His body was sending warning signs. There were mornings when he couldn't get out of bed because his back ached so badly, a symptom of kidney distress. There were days when his skin looked yellow, jaundice. He ignored them. He took a pill, he had a drink, he played the show. He believed that as long as he could play, he was safe. He believed that his musical utility was his insurance policy. He believed that Eric Clapton, the man he had saved from oblivion, would never abandon him. He was wrong. The music industry is not a family. It is a business. And in the late 1970s, the business was changing again. Punk rock was exploding in London. The Sex Pistols and the Clash were spitting on the legacy of dinosaur rockers like Clapton. The laid-back, bluesy 10-minute jams of the mid-70s were suddenly uncool. They were seen as bloated, bourgeois, and boring. Clapton, always sensitive to the winds of change, felt the shift. He knew he needed to evolve. He knew he needed to shed his skin again. And Carl Radle was part of the old skin. The resurrection was complete. Eric Clapton was a superstar again. He was rich, he was famous, and he was beginning to think about sobriety, or at least a different kind of life. He looked at his band, the Tulsa Mafia, the Drinking Buddies, the Enablers, and he didn't see saviors anymore. He saw weights. He saw the past. Carl didn't see the knife coming. He was too busy being the foundation to realize that when a ship prepares for a solo voyage, the anchor is the first thing cut loose. But the end was not yet. Before the silence, there would be one final blinding flash of glory. By 1977, the musical landscape was shifting violently. Punk rock was exploding in London. The Sex Pistols and the Clash were spitting on the legacy of dinosaur rockers like Clapton. The laid-back, bluesy jams were suddenly seen as bloated and boring. Clapton and his Tulsa Mafia seemed destined for the scrap heap. But in a bubble of luxury, insulated by platinum records and an endless supply of Courvoisier, Eric Clapton and his Tulsa Mafia were about to defy gravity one last time. They were about to record the biggest album of their lives. They called it Slow Hand. If Layla was the sound of raw, bleeding agony, and 461 Ocean Boulevard was the sound of a hazy, sun-drunk recovery, Slow Hand was the sound of professional confidence. It was the sound of a band that had played together so much they breathed in unison. Carl Radle was the cornerstone of this sound. By 1977, his playing had evolved into something almost architectural. He wasn't just playing bass lines, he was pouring concrete foundations. Consider the opening track, Cocaine. It is a cover of a J.J. Cale song, another nod to their Tulsa roots. On the surface, it's a simple rock song, but listen to the low end. Carl Radle is playing a driving, pulsing eighth-note rhythm that pushes the song forward with the relentless momentum of a speeding train. He isn't showing off. He is locking the groove down so tight that Clapton's guitar riff cuts through like a razor blade. It is a dark, propulsive groove, perfectly mimicking the frantic, nervous energy of the drug the song describes. Then compare that to Lay Down Sally. This was Clapton's attempt at a country rock shuffle, a direct tribute to the Tulsa sound. Here, Carl is loose, swinging, playing slightly behind the beat, creating that infectious porch music feel that makes it impossible not to tap your foot. And then there is Wonderful Tonight. This song would become the wedding anthem for a generation. It is sweet, sentimental, and soft, but in the hands of a lesser bassist, it would have been saccharine. Carl Radle plays it with a deep, mournful dignity. His bass notes are long, sustained, and warm. He creates a sonic embrace, a warm bed for the melody to lie in. He witnessed the real-life romance between Eric and Pattie Boyd. He saw the love and the pain, and he put that tenderness into his fingers. Slow Hand was released in November 1977. It was a monster hit. It reached number 2 on the charts, sitting right behind the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. Lay Down Sally and Wonderful Tonight became radio staples. Suddenly, Carl Radle wasn't just a respected musician, he was a wealthy man. The royalties and touring revenue were astronomical. He was flying on private jets, the famous Caesar's chariot, a customized Boeing 707 used by Led Zeppelin. He was staying in the presidential suites of the finest hotels in the world. He was living the rock star fantasy. But the view from the top of the mountain is deceptive. The higher you climb, the thinner the air becomes, and the thinner the air, the harder it is to think clearly. The Slow Hand era was the peak of the Tulsa Mafia's reign. They felt invincible. They were the boys from Oklahoma who had conquered the world. They were Eric Clapton's brothers. But brotherhood in the music business is a fragile construct, often held together by the glue of shared vice, and the vice was consuming them. The alcohol consumption during this period was legendary and terrifying. It wasn't just partying anymore, it was maintenance. They drank to wake up, they drank to rehearse, they drank to play, they drank to sleep. Carl Radle was no longer the skinny kid with the sharp jawline. He was heavy. His face was puffy and flushed. The spark behind his wire-rimmed glasses was growing dim, replaced by a glazed, distant look. He was suffering from chronic pain. His kidneys were beginning to fail, screaming under the assault of the alcohol. But he masked it with more drink and painkillers. He was in a state of denial. He believed that as long as the music was good, everything was fine, and the music was good on the record. But on the road, the cracks were becoming canyons. The 1978 tour was meant to be a victory lap. Instead, it became a death march. Eric Clapton was deteriorating. The functioning alcoholic was becoming non-functional. His temper was short. His performances were erratic. There were nights when he was brilliant, channeling the blues with a fire that silenced the room. But there were other nights when he was sloppy, indifferent, or openly hostile to the audience. And Carl Radle, the anchor, was beginning to drag. For years, Carl had covered for Eric. When Eric rushed, Carl slowed him down. When Eric dragged, Carl pushed him. But now Carl was tired. His body was failing. He couldn't carry the weight of the god anymore. The rhythm section, once the tightest in the world, began to wobble. The tension came to a head during a European tour where the opening act was none other than Muddy Waters. This was a cruel juxtaposition. Muddy Waters was the father of the blues, a man of immense dignity and power. He was old, but he was sharp. His band was disciplined. They played the blues with a reverence and a precision that was awe-inspiring. Then, Eric Clapton and his band would take the stage. They were younger, richer, and louder, but they were drunk. They were sloppy. Every night the contrast was brutal. Muddy Waters showed the audience what the blues was, a music of survival and dignity. Eric Clapton's band showed the audience what the blues could become when poisoned by excess, a music of indulgence and decay. Clapton knew it. He felt the shame. He idolized Muddy Waters. To go on stage after his hero while stumbling drunk was a humiliation. But instead of blaming the bottle, he began to blame the band. He began to look at Carl Radle, Jamie Oldaker, and Dick Sims, not as his brothers, but as his enablers. He looked at them and saw his own addiction reflected back at him. He saw the bloated faces, the glassy eyes, the sloppiness. He didn't see the years of loyalty. He didn't see the times Carl had saved him. He just saw a mirror he didn't want to look into anymore. The resentment grew in the silence. Clapton didn't confront them. That wasn't his way. He was passive-aggressive. He would throw tantrums about the sound. He would complain about the monitors. He would storm off stage. One infamous night, frustration boiled over. Clapton, enraged by a mistake or a technical glitch, threw his guitar across the stage. It was a shocking act of violence against his own instrument. It was a signal. The music had stopped bringing him joy. It had become a burden. And Carl Radle just stood there, thumping the root note, eyes hidden behind his sunglasses, trying to hold the song together while the world fell apart. In late 1978, They released the album Backless. The title was strangely prophetic. Backless implies something without a spine, something unsupported. The album is not bad, but it is tired. It sounds like a band running on fumes. The spark of slow hand is gone, replaced by a weary competence. It is the sound of men who are ready to go home. But Carl didn't want to go home. Home was Tulsa, and Tulsa was filled with ghosts. Home was a quiet house where the phone didn't ring. Home was the reality of his failing health. He wanted to stay on the bus. He wanted to stay in the bubble. He clung to the band like a life raft. He didn't know that the captain was already planning to scuttle the ship. The end came in 1979. It didn't come with a bang. It didn't come with a dramatic fight in a dressing room. It came with the cold bureaucratic efficiency of the music business. Eric Clapton had made a decision. He wanted to change his life. He finally proposed to Pattie Boyd. He was trying to cut down on the drinking, though true sobriety was still years away. He wanted a fresh start. He wanted to reinvent himself musically. To do that, he decided he needed to purge the past. He called his manager, Roger Forrester. He gave the order. Fire them. All of them. Carl Radle was in Tulsa, resting after the tour, waiting for the call to start rehearsals for the next album. He was expecting the itinerary. He was expecting the plane tickets. Instead, he got a letter, or perhaps a brief phone call from a manager. The details vary in the telling, but the outcome was the same. It was impersonal. It was final. Eric is moving in a new direction. Your services are no longer required, just like that. 9 years of sacrifice, of being the brother, the confidant, the musical anchor, erased in a single cold sentence. There was no farewell dinner, no gold watch, no thank you for saving my life. Just a termination notice. The brutality of it broke Carl Radle. It wasn't just the loss of a job. Musicians lose jobs all the time. Gigs end. Bands break up. That is the nature of the life. But this was different. This was a repudiation of his entire existence. Carl had defined himself by his loyalty to Eric. He was Clapton's bassist. That was his name. That was his honor. By firing him so coldly, Clapton wasn't just changing the lineup. He was saying that those 9 years meant nothing. He was saying that Carl was just an employee, a hired hand, easily replaced by the next guy in line. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. Carl tried to put on a brave face. He told friends in Tulsa, "Well, Eric wants to try something new. It's cool. I'll do my own thing." But it wasn't cool. He watched from afar as Clapton assembled a new band, an all-British band. Sleek, professional, modern. They played the old songs, Carl's songs, but they played them differently. Stiffer, cleaner. The Tulsa shuffle was gone, replaced by a polished pop rock sheen. Carl listened to the new records, and he must have felt like a ghost haunting his own life. That's my bass line, he must have thought. But that's not my soul. The golden handcuffs were off. He was free. But what is freedom to a man who has forgotten how to walk on his own? He was back in Tulsa. He was wealthy, yes. He had gold records on his wall. He had a legacy that would last forever. But he had no purpose. The phone stopped ringing. The friends who had surrounded him during the glory days, the hangers-on who wanted to be near the Clapton magic, suddenly disappeared. He was just Carl again. Carl Dean Radle, the quiet boy from Oklahoma. And the silence of Oklahoma was deafening. He tried to keep busy. He played on a few sessions. He jammed with old friends. But the fire was gone. He was going through the motions. And the pain, the physical pain, was becoming unbearable. His kidneys were failing. His liver was scarred. His body, which he had treated like a rental car for a decade, was finally breaking down. But the emotional pain was worse. The feeling of being discarded. The feeling of being used up and thrown away. He sat in his house in Claremore, Oklahoma. He looked at his bass guitar in the corner, the instrument that had taken him around the world, the instrument that had spoken for him when he couldn't find the words. Now it just looked like a piece of wood. He poured a drink, and then another. If he couldn't be the anchor for Eric Clapton, he would be the anchor for his own sinking ship. He would ride it all the way to the bottom. The winter of 1979 was cold in Oklahoma, but it was nothing compared to the coldness in Carl Radle's heart. The stage lights were off. The applause had faded. The bus had left the station without him. He was alone. The silence of Oklahoma is different from the silence of anywhere else on earth. It is not an empty silence. It is a heavy, expectant silence. It is the sound of the wind sweeping down the plains, bending the tall grass, whispering through the wire fences of the oil fields. It is a silence that demands you listen to your own thoughts. For Carl Radle, returning to Tulsa in 1979, this silence was deafening. He had spent the last decade living inside a hurricane. He had lived in the roar of jet engines, the scream of amplifiers, the thunder of applause, and the constant chaotic chatter of the dressing room. He had lived in a world where there was no silence, only the spaces between songs. Now suddenly, the volume had been turned down to 0. The exile began in a house in Claremore, a quiet town just outside of Tulsa. It was a nice house, the kind of home a successful man buys to settle down in. On the walls hung the artifacts of a life lived at the summit of the world, gold and platinum records framed in glass, photos of him standing shoulder to shoulder with George Harrison, Duane Allman, and Eric Clapton. There were guitars in the corners, amplifiers in the spare room, but a house full of trophies is not a home, it is a museum, and Carl Radle was becoming its curator and its ghost. The firing had shattered him. It wasn't just the loss of income, though the sudden stop of the massive touring checks was a shock. It was the loss of identity. For 10 years, the names Carl Radle and Eric Clapton were spoken in the same breath. He wasn't just a bassist. He was the left hand of the king. He'd shaped the sound, protected the man, and held the rhythm. To be cut loose with nothing more than a bureaucratic dismissal felt like an amputation. He walked through the rooms of his Claremore house, touching the furniture, looking out the window at the flat gray horizon, and wondering, who am I now? He was 37 years old. In a normal profession, 37 is the prime of life. In the brutal, youth-obsessed mathematics of rock and roll, 37 is the beginning of the end. He looked in the mirror and saw the toll the road had taken. His face was puffy, retaining water due to his failing kidneys. His eyes were perpetually red-rimmed. His skin had a pallid, unhealthy cast. The laid-back demeanor that had made him cool in his 20s now just looked like exhaustion. But the cruelest irony was that his hands were still perfect. He would pick up his bass guitar, plug it in, and sit on the edge of his bed. His fingers would find the groove instantly. The muscle memory was flawless. He could still play Layla in his sleep. He could still lock into a shuffle that would make a dead man dance. The talent hadn't faded. It was the world that had moved on. He tried to stay busy. He tried to convince himself that this was just a break, a hiatus. I'm just taking some time off, he told the few friends who called. Eric's trying a new thing. It won't last. He'll call me back. He clung to this hope with a desperate, tragic optimism. He truly believed that the new band Clapton had assembled was a mistake. He listened to the reports coming from the UK, heard about the cleaner, pop-oriented sound, and told himself it doesn't swing. Eric needs the swing. He needs the Tulsa touch. He waited for the phone to ring. Every time it did, his heart would jump. But it was never Eric. It was never the manager saying, we made a mistake, Carl. Come back. It was usually Jamie Oldacker or Dick Sims, the other members of the exiled Tulsa Mafia. They were in the same boat, cast adrift on the same life raft. They would meet up in the bars of Tulsa, huddled together like veterans of a war that nobody else remembered. These gatherings were bittersweet. They would drink heavily and reminisce. They would tell the old stories. Remember Miami? Remember the time George Harrison walked in? Remember the private jet? They lived in the past because the present was too painful to look at. But there was a dark undercurrent to these reunions. They were enabling each other's destruction. The bond that had held them together on the road, the shared addiction, was now the only thing they had left. Without the discipline of the show, without the need to be on stage at 8 p.m., the drinking became formless and endless. Carl's health began to deteriorate rapidly. The symptoms of kidney failure and liver cirrhosis are not subtle. There is the constant fatigue, the nausea, the swelling of the legs and ankles. There is the brain fog, a confusion caused by the toxins building up in the blood. He knew he was sick. He had to know, but he refused to see a doctor. Why? Perhaps it was fear. Fear that a doctor would tell him the party was truly over. Fear that he would be told he could never drink again. And for Carl, the drink was the only anesthesia strong enough to dull the pain of the betrayal. Or perhaps it was a slower, more passive form of suicide. He didn't put a gun to his head, he just stopped fighting for his life. He let the current take him. He did make a few attempts to work. He was, after all, a legend. When word got out that Carl Radle was available, there were offers. He played on a few sessions. He watched his friends moving on. Jamie Oldacre, the drummer who had locked in with him for so many years, packed his bags and found a new gig with the superstar Peter Frampton. It was the big time again. Stadiums, lights, action. But Carl stayed behind. There were rumors of offers, whispers of sessions, but the reality was brutal. His body ravaged by failing kidneys and the relentless toll of the road simply couldn't keep up. He wasn't the road warrior anymore. He was a casualty. While his rhythmic brother Jamie was back on the world stage, Carl was stuck in the silence of Claremore, watching the tour buses leave without him. He returned to Oklahoma, defeated again. The winter of 1979 turned into the spring of 1980. The 1970s, the decade that Carl Radle had helped define, were over. A new era was dawning. The radio was playing The Police, The Cars, Gary Newman. Synthesizers were replacing guitars. The drum machines were replacing the shuffle. The organic, human, sweaty sound of the Tulsa vibe was becoming a relic, a museum piece. Carl spent his days in Claremore, sinking deeper into isolation. The phone rang less and less. The visits from friends became infrequent. People were uncomfortable around him. It is hard to watch a man slowly destroy himself. It is hard to look into the eyes of a genius and see only a vacancy. There is a particularly heartbreaking story from this period. A local musician in Tulsa, a young kid who idolized the Tulsa sound, heard that Carl Radle was back in town. He worked up the courage to go to Carl's house. He knocked on the door, hoping to meet his hero, hoping maybe to get a lesson, or just to shake the hand that played on Layla. Carl opened the door. He was wearing a bathrobe. He looked frail, unshaven, and yellow. He invited the kid in. They sat in the living room, surrounded by the gold records. Carl was kind. He was gentle. He offered the kid a drink. He talked about music. He talked about bass lines. But then he asked the kid a question. "Have you heard from Eric?" The kid was confused. "Eric who?" "Eric Clapton. Have you heard if he's touring?" The tragedy of the moment was crushing. Here was a man completely disconnected from reality, asking a local teenager for news about one of the most famous men on earth. He was still waiting. He was a loyal friend waiting for a call that would never come. The kid left, shaken. He realized he hadn't met a legend. He had met a ghost. As May of 1980 approached, Carl's condition became critical. He was bloated, barely able to walk. His skin was the color of old parchment. He spent his days in a chair, slipping in and out of consciousness. The alcohol had done its job. It had numbed the pain, but it had also shut down the machinery. The foundation had cracked and the building was coming down. Yet even in this state, the music remained. Friends who visited him during those final weeks reported that he would still listen to records. He would put on old blues albums or the Layla record. He would sit there, eyes closed, tapping his swollen foot to the beat. He wasn't listening to the guitars. He wasn't listening to the vocals. He was listening to the pocket. He was listening to the space between the notes. He was back in Miami, back in the heat, back in the moment when the magic was real. He was listening to the sound of his own life before it went silent. There's a profound loneliness in the death of a sideman. When a frontman dies, a Jim Morrison, a Janis Joplin, a Jimi Hendrix, the world stops. There are candlelight vigils. There are headlines. The fans weep in the streets. But when a sideman dies, he dies alone. Carl Radle didn't have a manager checking on him every hour. He didn't have a bodyguard outside his door. He didn't have a PR team spinning the narrative. He just had an empty house in Oklahoma and a body that had given up. He was a casualty of the rock and roll war, but he wasn't a general. He was the infantryman who had carried the heavy pack, marched the longest miles, and been left behind on the battlefield when the army moved on. In the final days of May 1980, the silence in the house in Claremore grew absolute. The wind outside continued to blow, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding inside. The gold records on the wall gleamed in the afternoon sun, mute witnesses to a glory that felt like it belonged to a different century. Carl Radle, the man who had held up the sky for Eric Clapton, the man who had anchored the chaos of the greatest rock and roll era, was now drifting untethered. The anchor chain had snapped. He closed his eyes. He stopped fighting the current. He let go. The music was about to stop. The longest song was coming to its final bar. Friday, May 30th, 1980. The Oklahoma spring was turning into summer. The heat was beginning to rise off the asphalt, the air growing heavy and still. In Claremore, inside the house of the man who had played bass for the gods, the silence was finally broken. Carl Radle was dead. He was found in his home, his body finally surrendering to the years of abuse it had endured in the service of rock and roll. The official cause of death was the shutting down of his kidneys, complicated by the ravages of alcohol and narcotics. But the medical report tells only the biological truth. It does not tell the human truth. The final brutal reality is that Carl Radle died of exhaustion. He was a casualty of the rock and roll machine. He died because the purpose of his life, the music, the brotherhood, the loyalty, had been stripped away, leaving him with nothing but the silence. He was 37 years old, 37. It is a cursed number in art, dangerously close to the mythological 27 Club, but perhaps even sadder because it lacks the romantic glamour of youth. Dying at 37 isn't dying young in the rock star sense. It is dying just when you should be finding your second wind. It is a death of exhaustion, not explosion. The news of his passing did not stop the world. There were no breaking news bulletins interrupting television broadcasts. There were no weeping fans gathering in Hyde Park or Central Park. The world of 1980 was busy looking forward, obsessed with the new decade, the new sounds, the new fashions. The death of a bass player from the 1970s was, to the mainstream press, a footnote, a small obituary in the back pages of Rolling Stone, a brief mention on the local Tulsa news. But for the musicians who knew him, The shock was seismic. The funeral was held in Oklahoma. It was a modest affair. It was attended by his family, who had watched their quiet boy go off to conquer the world and come back broken. It was attended by the Tulsa Mafia, Jamie Oldaker, Dick Sims, the men who had shared the trenches with him, who saw their own mortality reflected in his coffin. But there was one person missing. Eric Clapton did not attend the funeral. The reasons given, if any were given at all, have been lost to time. Perhaps he was working. Perhaps he was battling his own demons. Perhaps the guilt was too heavy to bear. But his absence was a final crushing symbol of the asymmetry of their relationship. Carl had given 10 years of his life to Eric. He had waded through the heroin years. He had nursed him through the drunk years. He had been the anchor. And when the anchor was lowered into the ground, the ship sailed on. This is the brutal reality of the music business, stripped of its glamour and myth. It is a business that consumes people. It chews up talent and loyalty, extracts the magic, and spits out the husk. Carl Radle was a casualty of this machinery. He was a man who believed in the romantic ideal of the band of brothers, only to find out that he was an employee in a corporation. So, what is left? When the body is gone and the applause has faded and the betrayal has dulled into history, what remains of Carl Radle? The answer, thankfully, is immortal. The music remains. Legacy is a strange thing. It is not measured in the size of the funeral or the number of headlines. It is measured in the durability of the art. And by that measure, Carl Radle is a giant. Go back to the records. Put on Layla and other assorted love songs. Do not listen to it as background music. Listen to it as a conversation. Hear how Carl interacts with Jim Gordon's drums. Hear how he navigates the storm of guitars. That album is widely considered one of the top 10 rock albums ever made. It will be played for as long as human beings have electricity. And every time it is played, Carl lives. Put on 461 Ocean Boulevard. Feel the shift in the atmosphere. That album invented the adult rock sound of the 70s. It introduced reggae to the American mainstream. Carl's bass lines on that record are the blueprint for how to play with restraint, how to be heavy without being loud. Put on The Concert for Bangladesh. There is Carl in his gold-rimmed glasses, standing next to George Harrison, Ringo Starr, and Bob Dylan. He is holding the bottom end for the most famous musicians on the planet. He is the common denominator. He was the musician's musician. This is the highest compliment a player can receive. It means that while the fans might be looking at the singer, the people on stage are listening to you. It means you are the one they trust. Musicians today, bassists who are learning their craft, study Carl Radle. They study him not for his flash, but for his feel. They study the Radle pulse, that unique ability to play slightly behind the beat, creating a pocket that feels a mile wide. He taught generations of players that the most important note is often the one you don't play. In 2006, 26 years after his death, Carl Radle was finally inducted into the Oklahoma Music Hall of Fame. It was a long overdue recognition from the state that made him. It was a moment of validation for his family and for the legacy of the Tulsa sound. But perhaps his true legacy is not in the awards or the records. Perhaps his legacy is a cautionary tale. Carl Radle represents the tragic archetype of the sideman. He is the patron saint of the quiet ones. He reminds us that the people standing in the shadows are often the ones holding the building up. He reminds us that talent is not enough to save you from your demons. He reminds us that loyalty, while noble, can be a dangerous thing when placed in the hands of people who cannot return it. He was a man who needed to be needed. He found his worth in being the foundation for others, but he forgot to build a foundation for himself. When the weight of the others was removed, he had nothing left to stand on. Yet, there is a beauty in his tragedy. There is a dignity in his silence. In the end, he isn't standing at the front of the stage. He isn't trying to steal the spotlight. He is standing in the back, next to the drummer. He is wearing his sunglasses. He is nodding his head to the groove. He is playing a simple, perfect bass line, a G, a D, and A, locking in the rhythm, making everyone else sound better. He is doing the job he was born to do. And down here on earth, the music plays on. Every time Layla comes on the radio, every time Wonderful Tonight is played at a wedding, every time Cocaine blasts from a car window, we are hearing the heartbeat of Carl Radle. We hear the boy from Tulsa. We hear the man who saved Eric Clapton. We hear the quiet genius who gave everything he had to the music until there was nothing left to give. The song has ended. The amp is switched off. The case is closed. But the echo lasts forever